The sound was unmistakable, a tearing, ripping noise that cut through the smoke and chaos of the European front like nothing else in modern warfare. American soldiers called it Hitler's buzz saw. The German MG42, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, had already pinned down Sergeant Walter Brennan's squad for nearly 2 hours in a bombed-out farmhouse somewhere in the Hürtgen Forest. Outside, the November rain turned the churned earth into a brown slurry. Inside, 5 men pressed themselves against cold stone walls, listening to short bursts of that terrible weapon rake their position every time someone moved near a window. Private First Class Eddie Dooley, the squad's radioman, had caught a fragment in his shoulder during the last attempt to break cover. Now he sat propped against a wall, pale and bleeding through a field dressing that was already turning crimson. Time was running out. The German machine gun nest sat approximately 200 meters uphill, protected by sandbags and positioned to cover every approach to the crossroads that Brennan's platoon needed to secure before nightfall. Already 3 men from another squad lay motionless in the muddy field between the farmhouse and the tree line. Nobody had dared to retrieve them. In that moment, Corporal Joseph Kowalski pressed himself against the doorframe and reached for his pack. What he pulled out made Sergeant Brennan curse under his breath. It was an M1943 entrenching tool, but modified beyond anything the Army would have sanctioned. The blade had been sharpened on one edge like a hatchet, and wrapped around the handle with wire was something that looked like a canvas pouch stuffed with metal fragments, connected by a length of detonation cord to a timer cannibalized from a German S-mine that Kowalski had recovered weeks earlier. This device had already earned Kowalski a verbal reprimand from Lieutenant Patterson and a written warning that threatened court-martial if he ever deployed it. Field modifications to Army equipment without authorization were strictly prohibited. More importantly, the device was considered unstable and unpredictable. Patterson had called it a disaster waiting to happen. He had ordered Kowalski to dispose of it. Kowalski had not complied. Now, with Dooley bleeding out and the MG42 showing no signs of letting up, Kowalski looked at Brennan with an unspoken question in his eyes. Brennan stared at the improvised weapon, then at the field outside, then at Dooley. He nodded once. If you find stories like this one as fascinating as we do, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. We bring you deep dives into the forgotten moments of military history every week, the stories that fell through the cracks of the official record. Now, back to the Hürtgen Forest and a shovel that was about to change everything. To understand how Joseph Kowalski ended up crouched in that farmhouse with an unauthorized weapon that would either save his squad or get him court-martialed, we need to go back 3 months. Back to England, where the replacement soldiers waited for their orders to cross the Channel and join the grinding push toward Germany. Kowalski was 23 years old, the son of Polish immigrants who had settled in Pittsburgh and raised their children in the shadow of steel mills. Before the war, he had worked in those mills himself, learning to shape hot metal, to respect the violent potential of industrial machinery, and to improvise solutions when tools broke, and quotas demanded production continue regardless. This background would prove more valuable than any training the Army provided. The replacement depot outside Southampton was a purgatory of waiting. Thousands of young men, fresh from training camps in the States, spent their days cleaning equipment, attending lectures on topics they had already heard a dozen times, and wondering which unit would claim them and which battlefield would test them. Kowalski used the time differently. He wandered the depot, collecting scraps of metal, studying the equipment that combat veterans brought back for repair, and asking questions that made supply sergeants uncomfortable. What he observed troubled him. The standard infantry kit was designed for a kind of war that was already obsolete by 1944. Soldiers carried rifles and grenades for ranged combat and bayonets for close quarters, but the actual fighting in Normandy's hedgerows and Belgium's forests involved something else entirely. Soldiers encountered fortified positions that grenades could not reach and that rifle fire could not suppress. They faced machine gun nests protected by sandbags and positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that no frontal assault could survive. The solution, when tanks were unavailable, was to send men forward to die until enough had fallen to create cover for the ones behind them. Kowalski believed there had to be another way. The entrenching tool fascinated him. American soldiers carried the M1943 model, a folding shovel with a wooden handle and a steel blade that could be locked at various angles. It was designed for digging foxholes and latrines, nothing more. But Kowalski saw potential. The blade was solid steel, capable of holding an edge. The handle was sturdy enough to absorb significant force, and soldiers carried it everywhere, so close to hand that it could be deployed faster than any other tool in their kit. In World War I, soldiers had discovered the same potential. When trenches brought enemies face to face in conditions too cramped for rifles, the entrenching tool became a weapon of desperation and fury. Soldiers sharpened the edges and used them as hatchets in close-quarters battle. Some commanders officially encouraged the practice, others tried to suppress it, considering hand-to-hand combat with improvised weapons beneath the dignity of a modern army. Neither approach changed the fundamental reality that men would use whatever worked when their lives depended on it. What Kowalski envisioned went further. He did not want to simply sharpen his shovel for close combat. He wanted to create something that could disable a fortified position without requiring a direct assault. The idea came from an unlikely source, a conversation with a British sapper who had served in North Africa. The sapper described improvised charges that desert units had used against Italian and German positions, bundles of explosive material surrounded by metal fragments designed to be thrown or placed and detonated to create a lethal spray of shrapnel within an enclosed space. The devices were crude but effective. They could clear a machine gun pit or bunker without exposing the attacker to sustained fire during the approach. Kowalski asked if anyone had tried mounting such a device on a delivery mechanism, something that could extend the range and accuracy of placement. The sapper shrugged. In the desert, there had been no need. Positions were often visible from a distance, and soldiers could get close enough to throw by using terrain and cover. But in the forests and towns of Europe, where approaches were channeled and observed, throwing range might not be enough. Kowalski filed the information away and began to plan. His opportunity came after the breakout from Normandy, when his replacement unit finally received orders to join the front. Kowalski was assigned to the 28th Infantry Division, specifically to a rifle company that had already suffered heavy casualties in the hedgerow fighting. The division was pulling back to rest and refit before the next push, and that pause gave Kowalski time to explore his ideas. He found what he needed in the debris of the battlefield. Abandoned equipment littered the French countryside. German weapons and munitions lay scattered where their owners had fallen or fled. Among the detritus, Kowalski discovered the components that would make his modification possible. First, he acquired several German S-mines, the infamous Bouncing Bettys, that had claimed so many American legs and lives. The mines were designed to leap into the air when triggered, then detonate at waist height, spraying steel balls in all directions. Most soldiers avoided them like plague. Kowalski saw raw material. He carefully disassembled the mines, extracting the timing mechanisms, the steel ball shrapnel, and the explosive charges. He understood the risks. Any mistake could kill him and anyone nearby. But his time in the steel mills had taught him patience with dangerous materials, and he worked slowly, methodically, never rushing, always aware. From the mines, he harvested enough components for 3 prototype devices. Each consisted of a canvas pouch filled with steel fragments, surrounding a small explosive charge, with a timer mechanism that could be set for delays of 3 to 15 seconds. The pouch was designed to be attached to the handle of his entrenching tool, positioned just below the blade, secured by wire and leather strapping. The idea was simple. Kowalski would sharpen the blade of his shovel to serve as a throwing anchor. He would set the timer, hurl the shovel blade first toward a fortified position, and take cover before the charge detonated. The sharpened blade would ensure the shovel stuck where it landed, and the explosion would send shrapnel through the protective cover of sandbags or into the firing aperture of a bunker. It was not elegant, it was not approved. But if it worked, it could save lives. The first test nearly killed him. Kowalski found an isolated spot behind the lines, an old quarry that had been used for training exercises earlier in the campaign. He set up a target, a pile of sandbags similar to what might protect a machine gun position, and prepared his modified shovel. The timer was set for 10 seconds, long enough for him to throw and reach cover. He wound back, hurled the shovel with all his strength, and dove behind a rock. The shovel sailed through the air, the blade catching the light, and struck the sandbags at an awkward angle. The timer mechanism, damaged by the impact, detonated immediately. Kowalski felt the shock wave even behind his cover, and fragments whistled overhead. When he emerged, the sandbag pile was shredded. The shovel handle lay in splinters. The device had worked, but the timing flaw was catastrophic. An immediate detonation gave no margin for error. He would need to redesign the timer housing to protect it from impact shock. Over the following weeks, Kowalski refined his design. He reinforced the timer housing with a steel sleeve salvaged from artillery shell casings. He experimented with different attachment points on the shovel handle, eventually settling on a position that balanced throwing weight without interfering with the blade's ability to stick on impact. He adjusted the explosive charge, reducing the yield slightly to extend the timer reliability and increase the shrapnel velocity. Each iteration brought improvements, and each improvement brought new risks. Other soldiers noticed his work. Most dismissed it as the hobby of a disturbed mind. A few showed interest. One, a corporal named Rodriguez, who had been a demolitions enthusiast in civilian life, offered suggestions that solved the timer shock problem. Together, they created a mounting system that cradled the mechanism in a rubber-padded sleeve, absorbing the impact and giving the timer a chance to function properly. Lieutenant Patterson discovered the project in early October. He was inspecting equipment before the division's next advance when he noticed the modified entrenching tool in Kowalski's pack. His reaction was predictable. Improvised explosives were dangerous, unauthorized, and potentially destabilizing to unit discipline. If every soldier started modifying their equipment with found munitions, the chaos would be unmanageable. Worse, the device might fail catastrophically and kill friendlies. Patterson ordered Kowalski to disassemble the weapon and dispose of the components safely. He issued a written reprimand that went into Kowalski's service record, and he made clear that court-martial would follow any further violations. Kowalski nodded, saluted, and carried the entrenching tool back to his tent. He did not disassemble it. He could not explain why, except that something in his gut told him the time would come when rules would matter less than results. That time came in November, in the Hürtgen Forest. The division had been ordered to push through some of the most difficult terrain on the Western Front. Dense evergreen trees blocked artillery observation. Thick undergrowth channeled movement into predictable paths. And the Germans had prepared their positions with deadly precision, sighting machine guns and mortars to cover every approach. The fighting was apocalyptic. Companies that entered the forest at full strength emerged with a fraction of their men. Survivors described conditions that resembled the Western Front of 1917 more than the mobile warfare that liberation had seemed to promise. Men lived in holes scraped into frozen ground, endured constant shelling, and died in assaults against positions they could not see until they were already in the killing zone. The MG42 was the chief executioner. German doctrine placed the machine gun at the center of infantry tactics, reversing the American approach that emphasized riflemen supported by automatic weapons. A standard German squad was built around 1 or 2 MG42 crews, with riflemen serving primarily to protect and supply the gunners. The weapon itself was revolutionary, achieving rates of fire that Allied soldiers found almost incomprehensible. 1,200 rounds per minute meant 20 bullets per second, a continuous stream of destruction that could traverse a squad's worth of targets in moments. The psychological effect was perhaps as significant as the physical damage. Men who heard that sound, that tearing, ripping noise that gave the weapon its nickname, often froze or broke. Those who kept moving often died before they understood what was happening. Taking out an MG42 nest required either overwhelming firepower from tanks or artillery, or the willingness to accept catastrophic casualties in a direct assault. Neither option was always available. Brennan's squad entered the forest on November 12th as part of a company-level push toward a series of crossroads that controlled movement through the sector. The initial advance went smoothly, with German resistance limited to scattered small arms fire. By mid-afternoon, however, the company had run into the primary defensive line. Machine guns opened up from multiple positions, catching 2 platoons in the open and inflicting terrible casualties in the first moments of contact. Brennan's squad managed to reach the farmhouse by luck as much as skill, the building providing just enough cover to escape the initial slaughter. But now they were pinned, unable to advance or retreat, watching their wounded bleed while the German gunners waited for any sign of movement. Kowalski explained his plan in short, clipped sentences. He would work his way around the left side of the farmhouse, using a shallow drainage ditch for cover. The ditch ran within about 50 meters of the tree line, and from there he believed he could get close enough to throw. The MG42 nest was positioned to cover the approach from the farmhouse and the open field, but the angle to the drainage ditch was awkward. If he moved carefully, he might avoid detection long enough to close the distance. The modified shovel would do the rest. Brennan listened, weighing impossible options. 3 men had already died trying to suppress that gun. Dooley needed evacuation that could not happen while the MG42 remained active, and night was coming, which would bring cold that could kill the wounded as surely as any bullet. He looked at the shovel, at the improvised charge wrapped around its handle, and made his decision. The crawl through the drainage ditch took nearly 40 minutes. Kowalski moved inches at a time, keeping his body pressed into the mud, his entrenching tool cradled against his chest. The German gunners fired periodic bursts toward the farmhouse, the sound horrifically close, but the rounds passing overhead. Rain continued to fall, masking whatever noise Kowalski made and filling the ditch with several inches of freezing water. By the time he reached the end of the covered approach, he was shaking with cold, his fingers numb, his joints screaming for movement. He paused behind a fallen log, perhaps 40 meters from the position, and studied what he faced. The nest was well constructed, a semicircular wall of sandbags positioned at the edge of the tree line, with logs overhead providing protection from artillery fragments. The aperture faced the farmhouse and the field, a narrow slot through which the barrel of the MG42 protruded. Kowalski could see the gunner's assistant feeding a fresh belt into the weapon, preparing for the next burst. The angle was not ideal. He would need to throw from a crouch, exposing himself for the seconds it took to wind up and release. If the German spotted him before the throw, he was dead. If the throw missed, he was dead. If the timer failed again, he was dead. He exhaled slowly, counted to 3, and rose. The throw was clean. The throw was... Years of mill work had given Kowalski powerful shoulders and precise coordination, and the shovel flew true, turning once in the air before the sharpened blade struck the top edge of the sandbag wall and bit deep. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. The German gunner turned, confused by the sudden appearance of an American entrenching tool embedded in his fortification. Then the charge detonated. The explosion was not large by the standards of artillery or aerial bombs, but in the confined space of the machine gun nest, it was devastating. Steel fragments shredded the sandbags and everything behind them. The protective cover that had stopped rifle bullets became a secondary source of projectiles as shattered wood and metal fragments filled the air. When the smoke cleared, the MG42 was silent. Kowalski collapsed behind the fallen log, ears ringing, hands trembling with adrenaline and cold. From the farmhouse, he heard shouting, and then figures emerged, moving quickly across the field that had been a death trap moments before. Brennan reached him first, hauling him upright with a grip that bordered on violent. The sergeant's face was a mask of mud and rain, but his eyes held something that might have been wonder. Behind him, the squad's medic was already working on Dooley, and other soldiers were spreading out to secure the flanks. The path to the crossroads was open. The aftermath of that action was complicated. Brennan's report mentioned Kowalski's contribution without detailing the nature of the weapon used. Lieutenant Patterson, who had survived the day commanding what remained of his platoon, faced a difficult choice. The improvised device he had ordered destroyed had just saved lives and accomplished an objective that might otherwise have required an entire platoon assault with corresponding casualties. Court-martial remained technically possible, but pressing charges against a soldier who had just eliminated a fortified position single-handedly would be difficult to explain to anyone, including the battalion commander who wanted to know how a private had succeeded where conventional tactics had failed. Patterson chose pragmatism. He met privately with Kowalski that evening and listened to a detailed explanation of the device's design and function. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. By the end, Patterson's attitude had shifted from disciplinary to investigative. He did not approve of unauthorized modifications, and he still believed the device was inherently dangerous, but he recognized potential that extended beyond one successful throw. What if the design could be refined, standardized, and issued to soldiers facing similar situations? What if the Army's rigid approach to equipment was failing to leverage the ingenuity of the men who actually fought? These questions did not have easy answers, but Patterson decided that his job was to fight the current war, not to preserve doctrine for its own sake. He told Kowalski to keep the remaining devices ready, but to use them only under direct orders. He also began writing a report that would eventually reach intelligence officers interested in unconventional solutions. The next 3 weeks saw Kowalski's modified shovels deployed twice more, each time against fortified positions that conventional approaches had failed to reduce. The first was another machine gun nest similar to the original target, and the result was equally decisive. The second was a bunker that controlled a bridge the division needed for resupply. In that case, Kowalski worked with an engineer squad that helped him place the device more precisely, wedging the sharpened blade into a ventilation gap in the bunker's concrete facing. The detonation killed or incapacitated everyone inside without destroying the bridge or requiring the prolonged bombardment that the tactical situation made impossible. Word spread through the division, as word always did among soldiers. The shovel grenade, or Kowalski's special, as various troops called it, became the subject of rumor and fascination. And by early December, the modified entrenching tool had attracted attention beyond the division. Intelligence officers arrived to interview Kowalski and examine his remaining devices. Engineers tested the design against various targets, documenting blast patterns and fragment dispersal. Ordnance experts evaluated the components, identifying potential improvements that could increase reliability and reduce the risk of premature detonation. The conclusion of their report was cautiously positive. The improvised weapon represented a genuine tactical innovation, filling a gap between thrown grenades and heavy explosives that existing doctrine did not address. However, the improvised nature of the components made standardization difficult, and the risk of accidents remained significant. The recommendation was to study the concept further with an eye toward developing a purpose-built version that could be manufactured and issued through official channels. That development would not happen. During the war, the pace of events, the grinding advance through Germany, the discovery of concentration camps, the final collapse of the Nazi regime left no time for the careful development that a new weapon required. Kowalski survived the war, though many in his unit did not. He returned to Pittsburgh in late 1945, resumed work in the steel mills, married a woman from his old neighborhood, and rarely spoke of what he had done in Europe. The modified entrenching tool existed only in reports filed in warehouses, in the memories of the men who had seen it work, and in the handful of photographs that combat correspondents had taken during those bloody weeks in the Hürtgen Forest. But the concept did not disappear entirely. Military engineers who reviewed the wartime reports recognized that Kowalski had stumbled onto something significant, a principle that would inform weapon development for decades. The idea of a delivery mechanism for placed charges, something between a thrown grenade and a planted explosive, would eventually manifest in devices like the M72 Law and later generations of shoulder-fired weapons. The psychological impact of improvised solutions, of soldiers adapting equipment to meet challenges that designers had not anticipated, would become a recognized factor in military doctrine. And the entrenching tool itself would continue its evolution, gaining features that acknowledged its potential role beyond digging, including sharpened edges, serrated backs, and attachment points that owed something to the experiments of forgotten soldiers in forgotten forests. The MG42, too, left its legacy. Post-war analysis confirmed what frontline soldiers had experienced, that the weapon's rate of fire and reliability made it one of the most effective infantry weapons ever designed. The German Army's approach of centering tactics around the machine gun rather than the rifleman influenced military thinking worldwide. When West Germany rearmed in the 1950s, the Bundeswehr adopted a modified version designated the MG3, which remained in service for decades. American weapon designers studied captured examples extensively, incorporating lessons into the development of the M60 and later machine guns. The sound of Hitler's buzzsaw faded from the battlefields, but its echo persisted in arsenals around the world. What does Kowalski's story tell us about innovation in warfare? Perhaps that necessity truly is the mother of invention, that men facing death will find solutions that peacetime planners never imagined. Perhaps that military bureaucracy, for all its flaws, exists for reasons that become apparent only when discipline breaks down. Kowalski was lucky that his improvised device worked when it mattered. Other soldiers who attempted similar modifications were not so fortunate, and their names fill graves rather than reports. The line between ingenuity and recklessness is narrow, and the consequences of crossing it are measured in lives. Yet, without men willing to take those risks, to challenge regulations that no longer serve the situation, some objectives would never have been achieved, and some battles would have ended differently. The farmhouse where Brennan's squad made its stand no longer exists. Post-war reconstruction erased the scars of fighting, and today the crossroads hosts a quiet intersection where tourists occasionally stop to photograph the monument that marks what happened there. The drainage ditch where Kowalski crawled is filled in and planted with grass. The tree line where the MG42 nest commanded the approach is peaceful evergreens again, showing no sign of the violence that once erupted beneath their boughs. Only the monument remembers, listing names and dates, acknowledging sacrifice without detailing the specific horrors and triumphs that made up each man's experience. Joseph Kowalski's name does not appear on the monument. He survived. He went home. He lived the ordinary life that the dead could not. But somewhere in the archives of military history, in reports that researchers occasionally uncover and document, the story of the shovel-blade shrapnel modification survives. It is a footnote to the larger narrative of the war, a curiosity that illustrates both the desperation and the creativity that combat demanded. It reminds us that the soldiers who fought were not simply implementing tactics designed by distant commanders, but thinking, adapting, and improvising in ways that no training could fully prepare them for. They took the tools they were given and made them into something else, when the alternative was death. They broke rules when rules would have gotten them killed. And sometimes, against all odds and regulations, they succeeded. The Hürtgen Forest campaign remains one of the most controversial operations of the European theater. American casualties exceeded 30,000, making it one of the bloodiest battles in U.S. Army history. Critics argue that the terrain and German defenses made the operation inherently costly, that alternative approaches might have achieved similar objectives with fewer losses. Defenders maintain that the campaign tied down German forces that might otherwise have reinforced the Ardennes, potentially affecting the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge that erupted weeks later. The debate continues in military academies and history departments, examined by scholars who never felt the cold of that November rain or heard the sound of the MG42 tearing through their friends. For the men who were there, such debates are abstract. They knew only what was in front of them, the mud and the blood and the desperate need to survive. They made decisions with incomplete information under unimaginable pressure. Some of those decisions followed training and doctrine. Others, like Kowalski's modified shovel, broke every rule and somehow worked anyway. The war was too big and too chaotic for any single approach to dominate. It required riflemen and engineers, artillerymen and medics, generals who planned campaigns, and privates who improvised when plans fell apart. Each played a role that the others could not fill. Together they accomplished what seemed impossible, grinding forward through defenses that should have stopped them, enduring losses that should have broken them, until the enemy finally collapsed. Joseph Kowalski died in 1987 of causes unrelated to his wartime service. His children knew he had served in Europe, but learned few details. Like many veterans of that generation, Kowalski rarely spoke of combat, deflecting questions with jokes or changing the subject when pressed. The entrenching tool he carried home as a souvenir sat in his garage for decades, its blade still showing the notches where he had sharpened it, its handle still bearing faint marks from where the explosive charge had been attached. His grandchildren occasionally asked about it. He told them it was a shovel he had used in the war. That was true. It was also, for a few weeks in a forgotten forest, something much more. The story of the band modification that took out an MG42 nest is not famous. It does not appear in the major histories of the war, does not feature in documentaries or feature films. It exists in the margins, one small example among thousands of the adaptations that combat demanded. But it captures something essential about the human element of warfare, the capacity to think and create, even under conditions designed to reduce men to mere targets. The MG42 was a machine, superbly engineered, capable of delivering death at rates that no human reflexes could match. Yet it was defeated not by a superior machine, but by a piece of improvised equipment wielded by a single, determined man. Technology and ingenuity clashed, and ingenuity found a way. Today, soldiers in modern armies carry equipment that Kowalski could never have imagined. Night vision, precision munitions, instant communications, and robotic systems have transformed combat in ways that make the Hürtgen Forest seem ancient. Yet the fundamental challenges remain. Soldiers still face fortified positions. They still encounter situations that doctrine does not address. They still carry entrenching tools, updated versions that fold smaller and weigh less, but serve the same basic purpose. And some of them, in quiet moments, still wonder what else those tools might do if necessity demanded. The spirit of improvisation that drove Kowalski has not disappeared. It has simply found new materials to work with, new problems to solve, new risks to navigate. The lesson of the shovel blade shrapnel modification is not that soldiers should ignore regulations and build improvised explosives. That approach creates as many problems as it solves and risks more lives than it saves. The lesson is that the gap between what doctrine provides and what combat requires has always existed and always will. Filling that gap demands both institutional support for innovation and individual willingness to think beyond training. It requires commanders who recognize when rules have become obstacles and soldiers who understand when improvisation is necessary. It demands a balance between discipline and creativity that no manual can prescribe and no regulation can enforce. The soldiers who achieve that balance are the ones who accomplish the impossible. Kowalski was one of them. There were others. There will be more. The rain stopped falling on the Hürtgen Forest in late November 1944, replaced by the first snows of winter. The fighting continued, brutal and relentless, until the last German positions were finally cleared in February 1945. The division that Kowalski served with emerged from the forest battered but intact, rebuilt with replacements, and continued the advance that would end in Germany's heartland. The shovel blade modification was never officially adopted, never standardized, never issued to other units. It remained what it had always been, an improvised solution to an impossible problem, conceived by a steel worker from Pittsburgh who refused to accept that some positions could not be taken. That refusal, that stubborn determination to find another way, is perhaps the most American quality a soldier can possess. It is also the most universal. Wherever men have fought, some have improvised. Wherever rules have proven inadequate, some have broken them. And occasionally, against all odds, breaking the rules has made all the difference. The crossroads that Brennan's squad helped secure served as a supply route for the rest of the campaign. Trucks carried ammunition and food and medical supplies over ground that had cost lives to open. The men who died there made possible the movements of thousands who came after. The man who eliminated the machine gun that blocked that ground returned to anonymity, his name known only to the few who served beside him and the fewer still who read the reports filed decades ago. That is how most military history works. The famous actions get remembered. The countless smaller actions that made them possible fade into footnotes and archives. But every footnote was someone's story. Every archive entry was someone's moment of terror or courage or both. The Hürtgen Forest is full of such moments, millions of them, each one as real and as important as anything that appears in the history books. This is one of them. A shovel with a sharpened blade, a pouch of shrapnel wrapped around the handle, a timer salvaged from an enemy mine, a throw in the rain, an explosion that changed everything for one squad on one afternoon in one tiny corner of a war that spanned continents. The regulations called it unauthorized. The men who survived called it salvation. History, as it usually does, forgot to call it anything at all.